So I'm going to switch gears a little bit because our project was really focused on the technology of CDS and the authoring of CDS and really asking the question why it wasn't being used very broadly around the country. So we actually started out, the project underwent a significant change in the end of year 2 with ONC direction. The initial participants included folks that are listed here, with Mary Goldstein, who's here, and other folks at Stanford. Emery Fry, originally part of the scope, but that got changed when the project direction changed. And kind of wanted to give you a little perspective about where CDS has been and where it's going. A lot of CDS over the past, actually 50 years or more, has been focused on things like rules, diagnostic decision support, order sets, info buttons. And even that limited focus has had a very spotty uptake. And what we've noticed actually over the last 7 to 10 years is that there's a whole lot of other things that we need to do to help make good decisions. And that's been brought about by things like precision medicine and personal sensors, by increasing patient self-management, by being able to extract more things from the record, by NLP techniques, by big data analytics, a lot of the things we've talked about today, and certainly by the improvements in visualization and cognitive support through other kinds of methods of interacting with the system. And the other things that are happening are the ability to kind of begin to layer apps and other kinds of tools on top of the underlying EHR, which kind of open up the freedom to innovate and come up with new ways to collect data, integrate data, and present it. And that's also being driven by a lot of new incentives and emphases that are changing healthcare that I don't need to enumerate here, but are listed. And so just a little self-plug here. We had a book in 2007 that talked about the road ahead, talking about these traditional modes of decision support. And just a scant 7 years later, the book expanded. It's coming out in May, if anybody wants to buy it. And it's got 926 pages and 8 new chapters, and it really deals with all these new topics that are now part of the landscape of CDS. So in looking back, and looking forward, which Chris Ann asked us to do, I wanted to reflect where is CDS going, why have we kind of gone through this evolution, what have we actually, what are we now seeing as the prospects for the future. So the initial aspects that Project 2B addressed were why those traditional methods like rules were not widely used except in academic medical centers, and why it took so much effort to get them to be used, and particularly addressing the plight of the small practice that didn't have IT staffs, and how they could, why they tended to turn off rules rather than use them. And it has to do with how rules fit with the workflow in the organization, the setting, how it's triggered, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, how you want the rule to surface in terms of recommendations. Do they page the doctor? Do they have a pop-up? Do they do this or that? And so all these things were very institution and setting specific. And if you just take the out-of-the-box rule, they wouldn't tend to work. So there was a lot of effort being spent to this customization process. And we got involved in trying to define kind of an ontology of setting-specific factors, things like how it should be triggered and how what the timing is. Should it be pre-event warning that something is due, or should you wait and see if the doctor does it and let them know afterwards? What kind of alert or what kind of way you want to surface it in terms of the email or the paging and so on, and all these things. And we thought that if you could actually categorize these and abstract these factors that went into authoring a rule, you could actually build an implementation science by having kind of the parameters that were useful in kind of mapping to a particular kind of workflow that were actually used and not dismissed all the time and so on. And compare that, you could actually retrieve experience based on what those parameters were that made a rule successful versus not. So we thought this might lead to kind of creating an implementation science. The difficulty partly is that a lot of the very customization activity occurs in a host rule language, and it also is kind of obscured from the subject matter experts who really know the nuances. So there really isn't kind of a good knowledge management approach to keep track of what your knowledge is either. So our original goals of Project 2B were to kind of create a model. It actually was a 4-stage model of rule refinement, where you had the kind of general human readable rule with very simple categories of structure of like who it's to be done, what's to be done, and where it's to be done, and things like that, with English fillers. The second level was to try to have formal coding of those elements, but still very generic. The third level would be an iterative process of adaptation to workflow and setting and so on, but still in this kind of abstract language. And then the fourth level would be conversion to a host-specific environment, including mapping of the data and also mapping of the rule knowledge representation. And we began working with some settings in our own institutions to try to validate that, and some small practices. And we got part of the way through that when basically the scope changed. And ONC developed this initiative called the Healthy Decisions Initiative, which is part of the Standards and Interoperability Framework, or S&I, initiatives at ONC. And there were two main use cases that were being addressed by this broad community. CDS artifact sharing, so that if best practice knowledge were to be, well, let's say, mandated, how could a set of close to executable rules be disseminated throughout the country, and then have them be taken up by the various EHRs and various installations of EHRs most effectively. So the idea was to come up with a model for representing this set of knowledge, not just rules, but order sets and documentation templates. The second part, which we didn't spend so much time addressing, but which there's some crossover to, is how you might build a separate service, a web service that would furnish up the decision from a decision rule. So this is just an example of the web page for the Healthy Decisions framework. You can find it by searching ONC Healthy Decisions. The project is actually closing out, next week? As having accomplished what it set out to do. So it's been a very useful process with many, many contributors throughout the country doing this. And what we've worked on ourselves is participating in the modeling of this generic interlingua for knowledge. And David Satara, who's here, was very instrumental in the core group that was actually building that model. And so he can actually explain that in much more detail than I can if you want to catch him during the break. But there's an XML specification for best practice knowledge, but beyond that, there was a formal model of every element, events, triggers, actions, rule, clause types, and so on. And so what you end up having is a representation that, because it's formal, can be converted to other forms. So you can have this kind of neutral interlingua, and you can generate rules or ardent syntax or other languages from it. And so our second task, beside contributing to that, was also to create a model-driven authoring tool that will allow you to create and manage CDS knowledge artifacts that could be then disseminated through this best practice process that I mentioned. Now, so just to back up, so we focused on the level 2 knowledge, which is this generic knowledge with formal coding of the knowledge elements, and not on the adaptations to setting specific factors that I mentioned, because ONC basically rightly said that it is not their province to actually detail all those different variations, but rather to provide the generic knowledge and then enable sites to do the further modification. But I'll show you a little bit later how that fits into the process. Our third goal was to try to figure out how do we actually position this tool and this capability so that it can continue and thrive after the ONC funding, the SHARP project, is over. Now, part of underlying this was this formal model, which I won't go into here, and there's actually it's all based on some well-defined other underlying ontologies and representations. The editor, which we hoped to be able to show you in the break, but it's not quite ready, will be made available by the end of the month. Our target is still to get a working first version by the end of March 31st. So we basically are able to model all the elements, and I won't even show you, in fact I hate to in front of the usability experts here because we haven't gone through extensive usability testing, but there's ability to model the metadata, and there's kind of a ability to create plugs of components to model and create rule logic and to combine them together. And so that's the paradigm we've been using, and we're doing some usability testing of that. The subject matter oriented editor is the idea of not just having knowledge engineers be able to do this, but be able to do it by being a clinician that wants to create a rule or read a rule. So by having this model driven thing, you can create human readable XML renditions of this. You can also author things by creating basically primitives. For example, an HbA1c greater than 7 rule is a lab test greater than a threshold. And so if you create primitives for these various types and then be able to recognize as you start typing what a rule is, you can recognize what type it is and what kinds of relationships it participates in and suggest those to the author. And so we're working on developing those kinds of things. And again, we're trying to improve the usability and the refinement of that. There's various template types that we've identified, primitive types. There's, I don't know, how many do we have now, 30 or 40? Initial study we did back at Partners when I was there were 42 being used, 42 primitive types of relationships, like lab tests greater than something, lab test existed in the past 6 months, medication conflicts with another or has an interaction with something else, many types like that, but there were only like 40 to 50 basic types. So if you had those and you had a library of those, you can create kind of the templates for authoring them. And this just is an example of a kind of a template that would show up. Well, so what I wanted to kind of just spend a minute or two on as my closing time ticks away is where do we go beyond this? The need for an interlingua is fraught a little bit by the fact that there isn't a customer for it yet, because if meaningful use stage 3 will demand it, then there may be a customer base. But right now, as we looked at various vendors, they all have rule editing, authoring systems of their own that they use with their customers. And so there isn't a real demand for them to go outside of that to author in another environment. What we do find, though, is that some of our enterprises, like I'm associated with Mayo Clinic, and they have 2 different vendor systems. Many other larger enterprises are in a similar boat, and they have no way to kind of collect the knowledge that they have into a knowledge management environment where they can keep track of what they have in a human readable form that then can be ported over to the underlying system. So one of our thoughts is to expand this into a knowledge repository that will allow that to occur, where they can edit in this editing environment, have the human readable form, and then have it kind of synchronized with the executable form in the various host systems. And so there's technical things that need to be done to make that happen that are listed here. But what we think could happen is if you take this kind of model-driven approach where every element in the rule or the knowledge artifact, the order set, is based on a model, it can all be indexed by context, so that it allows you to have a kind of knowledge repository that's indexed by the situation and context. Toby mentioned situation awareness. Let's imagine that you are taking care of Mrs. Jones, and Mrs. Jones has certain problems, and you have a certain specialty, and you're in a particular setting like an office, and the lab result is of a certain value is decreasing. And so all of a sudden now there's a context in which you can then pull up all related knowledge, and that context can almost be tracked automatically. So we can kind of imagine kind of an ability to have a model for automatically pulling up guidance at the situation you have. So kind of imagining that you have a bunch of ontologies, and then that just pulls up a set of rules and knowledge artifacts that could be almost displayed. I just got a set of Google glasses, and you could imagine having a little warning in my corner of my eye that tells me that there's a lab alert that's pertinent here, or there's a medication that should be considered, or things like that. So we're looking at those kinds of things to be able to improve this. So we think that knowledge management is a potentially important capability that could enable a lot of different ways to deliver CDS in this new world. Also allows you to understand where you have gaps and where you don't, and where you might need to use big data to actually resolve how to take care of a certain situation, or where you have conflicting knowledge, or you want to update knowledge, and things like that. So that's basically where I think we are, and we also could have kind of this ability now to index things and keep track of which ones are used and not used to, again, come back to this idea of an implementation science.